Welcome to another episode of Jay's Talk. So, there's been a lot of things going on, and I've been trying to work on a spot to start doing this more regularly, but finances haven't been so good to me, and there's just been a lot of stuff going on. And then, of course, we had this hurricane come through and knock out quite a bit of stuff, so now we're without power. So I apologize for how dark it is and everything, but it's a work in progress. I took a bunch of notes. I want to discuss Genesis chapter 1, particularly verse 27, the creation of man. So, I've said before that I don't belong to a particular church group or anything. I'm just strictly a believer. I never went to college to learn to study the Bible or anything. I'm pretty a conspiracy freak on that. I think that if the devil wanted to persuade man to think a certain way, then going to college to learn to read the Bible would be a good way to do it. And because of that, I also believe that you don't need somebody else to teach you how to read the Bible and how to understand it. You just need God. So, with that in mind, I did some study on Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, where it talks about the creation of man. Now, this verse is so detailed for just one verse that it's easy to overlook. It's easy to misinterpret. It's all kinds of easy to overlook. But I kind of broke it down, and I had God work this out and explain this. And if it looks like I have a red mustache, it's because I've been drinking red Kool-Aid quite often today. So, with all that out of the way, let me just read my notes, and then we'll kind of go from there. That might be all I have to do, I don't know. Because I did do pretty good detailed notes. So, to start, let's talk about God's image, okay? God's image and man's image, okay? God created us in His image. And the first creation of us that He did, and which is what this whole verse is about, okay? This verse, He didn't create us physically, He created us spiritually. And we know this because you can go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, and that's where it talks about the creation of our physical form. And then it also talks about the separation of our physical form, which is where Adam and Eve come from on a physical plane, okay? They're two separate people at this point. But when God first created us, He didn't create us separate. And the way that we can understand this is if we look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So, in order to understand ourselves, we must first understand God, for we are made in His image and in His likeness. And by reading the Bible as a whole, you can understand God's demeanor and His personality, such as His kindness, His humility, His, everything about Him. We can see His goodness, and we can see it in ourselves as well. We can see where we falter, but we can see where we get that from. We can tell that that is God. Alright? So by reading the Bible, we can understand God's demeanor and His personality, but we don't see God's gender. And I bring this up because the fact that we always look at God like He's a man, but we don't take into consideration that, for starters, God is a spiritual being. Jesus was the only physical form of God that we've experienced. So, when you look at God in a spiritual sense, He doesn't really have a gender, right? But we have to go back to what Genesis 1:27 is telling us, okay? That He created us in His image. And in His image He created us, okay? And it points this out, two specific points on how He's creating us. And it doesn't separate it until the last point, but it's all in that same verse, okay? So let me finish my notes here, and then if I need to, I'll go back over this again. But I keep getting myself sidetracked here. Alright, so again, by reading the Bible, we can understand God's demeanor and His personality. But we don't see God's gender, at least not unless we look at Jesus, and then we assume, because Jesus was a male by appearance, then God must be too. However, How does that explain the creation of Jesus? We can again assume that God can create whatever he wants, however he wants, but doesn't that go against our creation in his image? Again, referring to the fact that when you read Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, okay, and you point at the three separations of this one creation that he's doing, then you can tell he's creating a man, he's creating a being, but he's creating it to be two separate entities as one thing, okay? So he's creating a man and a woman as one being, and it's a spiritual being. Okay, and the reason this is important and to understand it like this is because if we were created this way in his image, then that means that God is the same way. Alright, so if spiritually we are all hermaphrodites, then that means that God himself is a hermaphrodite. Okay, now let me continue. Instead, I challenge you to read Genesis 1:27 with an open mind. We can see the importance of God's creation of man because it emphasized twice before broken down into the male and female part, which is basically the same thing I've been saying, okay? All this verse is in one verse. All this is it's all listed as one verse, which means that it's not to be taken as two separate deals. It's not to be taken as two separate accounts. This is all under one thing. Alright, so basically he's telling us, I did this in quotations, I'm creating man in my own image, and this image of man I'm creating is both male and female. Mind you now, this isn't a physical creation of man, because we don't get there to Genesis chapter 2 verse 7, okay? So seeing as how we're looking at this as a spiritual deal, and we know we're created in God's own image, and we can then understand the creation of Jesus because Jesus was created spiritually before he was created physically, just like we were, okay? So, look, the way that a rabbi had explained it to me so that I understood this was he said that God himself is like a thought, okay? He thinks about what he wants to create, but until it is spoken, it's not created. That spoken word of God is Jesus. So in other words, when he went from a thought to a voice, that was the creation of Jesus, okay? And so we know that through that, everything that we have, everything that we see was created through Jesus listening and obeying to his Father, who said, hey, this is what I want. I need you to go out here and speak this so we can have it created. Now, we know that Jesus is the spoken word of God. We know Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, okay? And we know, this part might offend some people, and I'm sorry, I'm pretty vulgar at times, but this was a pretty important point that I saw that needed to be addressed here, okay? At least from my perspective. We know that Mary was a virgin, and as a virgin, Mary conceived a child of, the child of God. She conceived Jesus as a virgin, right? Which means that God didn't sleep with her, because if he did, then she wouldn't be a virgin. Alright, so we also know, based on the beginning of the Word, okay, we know that Jesus was already created spiritually. So, if we can safely assume here that God did not sleep with Mary to create Jesus otherwise, then it seems more apt that if he slept with anybody, he slept with himself to create Jesus. Not saying that that's what he did, but just saying, if you had to look at it from a sexual perspective, then that's more apt to be what he did. And the reason he doesn't have to do it that way is because he's God. He can do it however he wants to. But we know, based on what he teaches, that he did not sleep with Mary. Otherwise, Mary wouldn't be a virgin. Which means that the creation of Jesus had to have happened before Mary, and before that before she conceived him. So basically, it's like God created Jesus spiritually and then said, hey, Mary, I need you to be a surrogate mother. Please birth this child so that way we can have it in the physical realm. Okay? And with that, we also have to keep in mind that if Jesus was to come out hermaphrodite in a physical form, then nobody would be taking him as seriously as they did. The reason he had to be a male was because nobody else was going to listen to him otherwise. He can't go out there and preach to a bunch of women because women had no rights. Alright, so we know that God had to create Jesus spiritually and use Mary as a surrogate mother to conceive Jesus physically. And yeah, I'm just basically repeating everything I just went over. So that's the end of my notes. Basically, God can do whatever he wants to. But we can look at Jesus and we can see where there are femme qualities as much as there are masculine qualities. And as far as Jesus' sexuality goes, I think that Jesus chose the path of a eunuch. I don't think he was a natural born eunuch, because if he was, then again, people wouldn't be taking him seriously as a man, okay? So he had to be born a man, and he had to be made a pure image of man, because anything less, he wouldn't be perfect, and nobody would accept him for who he is. To the extent that we accepted him, keep that in mind. So, you know, we got to keep an open mind when we read the Bible. And I believe that the Bible's going to hold all the answers. But if we're too busy looking at how mankind has already taught us to interpret things, instead of how God teaches us to interpret things, we're not going to get anywhere, and we're still going to breed greed and hatred, which is what we're doing. So, you know, let's stop the hatred. Let's get along. Let's love each other. This is Jace. I'll see you guys in the next one.